Country may be one of America's biggest musical genres, but that doesn't mean its stars don't sometimes run into a little money trouble, or in some cases, go flat broke.
What you gonna do with all your money?
Well, when I get it, I think I'll have plenty of use for it.
Tammy Wynette was once owed a fair share of child support payments from fellow star George Jones, who went bankrupt in 1978. But a decade later, Wynette found herself in some trouble of her own. In 1988, she owed $900,000 to the government and an additional $1 million to various other creditors. There was some disagreement among the parties involved over who was to blame for this and whether Wynette's bank had failed to keep accurate records of her loan repayments. Wynette's husband at the time, George Ritchie, said, "Tammy and I are merely the victims of people who are sharper with a pencil than she and I are." When negotiations to settle Wynette's government debt fell apart, the U.S. Marshals came to take her house. Allegedly, they gave no warning that this was about to happen and even waited until Wynette was out of town to move in. Her attorney, Ralph Gordon, told UPI, "We were shocked when we found out this morning that rather than attempting to further negotiate the matter, a U.S. Marshal showed up to levy the house and property." Over the next decade, Wynette was able to get her finances back in order, enough so that she had some money to leave when she died suddenly in 1998. Even in death, though, she was plagued by money trouble, as Ritchie feuded with her daughters over who would inherit her fortune. For a long time, Merle Haggard was riding one heck of a wave. Between 1973 and 1976, all 9 singles he released went to #1, and by 1990, he had 95 hit singles to his name. Over a third of those hits had topped the country charts. As is often the case with the rich and famous, Haggard wasn't afraid to employ a little creative accounting every now and then. Once, the IRS sent an agent to his home to discuss what they believed to be some excessive business deductions. Haggard decided to show the agent around his ranch, pointing out everything that gave him inspiration. As he later told the Tampa Bay Times, "Finally, this fellow looks at me and says, 'Why, Mr. Haggard, everything you do is a write-off.' And he started pointing out other things I should have declared." And that's the story of how Merle Haggard ended up owing the IRS around $5 million. By 1992, Haggard's money was gone. He filed for bankruptcy in December of that year, the same day his third wife gave birth to his 6th child. Regarding his decision to file for bankruptcy, Haggard told the Nashville Banner, "I think this is all for my benefit, to stand back and to praise things where nobody can touch me for a little bit. Hopefully, I won't be in there long." To settle his debts, Haggard ended up selling the rights to 600 of his songs for $3 million. Freddy Fender started out making rock music in the 1950s, before his career was interrupted by a jail sentence. In the 70s, he switched to making Tejano music and became a huge crossover success on the pop charts. Speaking about that era to the Los Angeles Times, he recalled, "Music-wise and art-wise, it was the best years of my life, but I didn't get the money. I did a lot of drinking and drugging. I didn't keep my eyes on the money, and like a lot of artists, I got ripped off." Fender would soon become flat broke, in part due to a horrific tragedy. On the road in 1981, his tour bus dropped him off and then continued on without him. Minutes later, the bus got into an accident that killed Fender's 39-year-old drummer, Joseph Lambert, and the 45-year-old driver, Joseph Parker. Already deep in debt by that point, the resulting lawsuits bankrupted him. Fender spent the rest of the 80s playing gigs for hardly any money. Then in 1989, he helped form the Texas Tornadoes, a Tejano supergroup. Chart success and Grammy wins soon followed. As Fender himself once said, "I'm not one to think like, poor me. I've always accepted the ups and downs. Maybe I've had to start all over again a few times, but at least I'm not an old cup of stale coffee. I've had a few refills." November 9th, 1990 was not a good day for Willie Nelson. Looking to claw back the $16.7 million in back taxes Nelson owed after using illegal tax shelters for years, the IRS seized his assets across multiple states. At the time, Nelson insisted that he'd be all right just so long as he still had his guitar.
Just got a good sound.
But his wife, Annie D'Angelo, begged to differ. She told People magazine, "I know he came off as super calm, but he wasn't that calm inside. We had 2 kids. It was super stressful. They seized our house. We were living in this little condo, all 4 of us, because Micah was a baby. It was frustrating." Nelson had to work hard to get himself out of that financial hole. He starred in a few Taco Bell commercials, for example, and also released a studio album titled The IRS Tapes, Who Will Buy My Memories? A portion of the sales for that release went straight into the government's pockets. Still, despite all this, Nelson claims the whole affair could have been a lot worse. He later told Rolling Stone, By the time everybody else heard about it, I was already onto other things. Mentally, it was a breeze. The IRS didn't bother me. They didn't come out and confiscate anything other than that first day, and they didn't show up at every gig and demand money. I appreciated that. George Jones was the country superstar of all country superstars. Waylon Jennings once told Spin magazine, "If everybody sounded like they wanted to, they'd all sound like George Jones." Jones's talent was immense, and he had a knack for being able to connect with listeners through his music and lyrics, which only made it more tragic that, for most of his career, he was struggling with alcoholism and drug abuse.
I went to about the lowest that you could go.
By the end of 1978, Jones could no longer hold things together. The bank was calling in a loan. He had an arrest warrant out for him in Tennessee due to missing child support payments, and he was supposed to pay $300,000 to promoters at the shows he'd failed to show up to in the previous 2 years. So, with no way out of financial ruin, Jones filed for bankruptcy. His petition listed $1.5 million in debts against just $64,500 in assets. As the bankruptcy case unfolded, it was discovered that, despite having earned $2 million in the previous 2 years, Jones only knew what happened to about $30,000 of it. In the end, the country stars who so admired Jones tried to help him out. Willie Nelson, Linda Ronstadt, Elvis Costello, and more lent their talents to an album of duets. While that album failed to find much success in the charts, Jones did enjoy an impressive comeback in the early 80s, and he continued to make music throughout the 90s and 2000s. Looking back, the story of Waylon Jennings' financial woes seems all the more tragic, as he'd tried so hard to be there for his friend George Jones when Jones filed for bankruptcy in 1978. As soon as Jennings heard Jones was officially broke, he went to Jones's home and handed him a bag containing $26,000. At the time, Jennings certainly had the money to spare, as he'd scored 8 #1 songs on the Billboard country chart. Unfortunately, within just a few years, he had ended up $2.5 million in debt. A lot of that money was going into drugs. He later told Spin, "I must have the constitution of 10 men, because right at the end I was doing like $1,500 a day in cocaine."
There's no way that you're right on anything when you're on drugs.
To avoid declaring bankruptcy, he began touring, and he toured hard. He also began writing his autobiography, although he also told the Las Vegas Sun that he'd decided against earning a bit of extra cash in the process. Jennings joked, "I could have owned Johnny Cash's and Willie Nelson's home by blackmailing them, but I didn't do that." Conway Twitty always cared about his reputation, and so owing people money was simply not an option. This fact became particularly relevant after Twitty tried to branch out into the fast food business and failed miserably. He said at the time, "What I know about is how to make records and how to sing songs, and I'm not too good at anything else." And Twitty Burger is a prime example. The problem was that people he knew and cared about had invested in his Twitty Burger business. After the franchise went bust, Twitty refused to leave them hanging and paid back all his investors personally. This cost a lot of money, of course, and so he decided to write it all off on his taxes. The IRS didn't buy it, though. In a precedent-setting lawsuit, the agency attempted to argue that worrying about your reputation as a down-home country star doesn't mean you can count your debts as a business expense. But what made this lawsuit so notable is how it all ended. Inspired by the presence of country music royalty, the judge decided to write some lyrics to sum up his decision in Twitty's favor, which he called the Ode to Conway Twitty. His final line read, "Had Conway not repaid the investors, his career would have been under cloud. Under the unique facts of this case, held that deductions are allowed." Between 1989 and 1999, Lorrie Morgan scored 14 top 10 singles on the Billboard Hot Country Songs chart, including 3 that hit #1 and 7 top 10 albums. She continued to release music after that, but the biggest years of her career seemed to be behind her. And so, in 2008, Morgan filed for bankruptcy. At the time, she was in the middle of a divorce from her country star husband Sammy Kershaw, and he had filed for bankruptcy himself not long before she did. This is because they had both been tied to a failed chicken restaurant, and the lenders were calling in the loans. The IRS said they were owed money too, and another bank claimed they were owed money from years-old outstanding loans unrelated to the restaurant. At one point, Morgan's home was almost seized by U.S. Marshals, although a judge blocked this seizure before it could take place. Of course, a lot of people were struggling financially in 2008, and Morgan was well aware of this. In a statement, she said, "It's very important to me that my fans and business associates understand that I'm okay. Today's economic times have affected many American families and businesses. I, along with many of you, am not immune to this fact." Randy Travis has sold more than 20 million albums, had a whopping 16 #1 hits on the country charts, and even managed to cross over #1 with Carrie Underwood, which topped the Billboard Hot 100 in 2009. Soon after, however, things began to go downhill for the singer. Travis was arrested twice in 2012, including one occasion on which he tried to buy cigarettes while drunk and naked. Around this time, he was also in the middle of an expensive divorce from his wife of almost 2 decades. Then, after suffering a stroke in 2013, he became unable to sing. By 2019, Travis was broke. In an attempt to improve his financial situation, he wrote a memoir. His co-author, Ken Abraham, told Taste of Country, "I think that is part of the story of Randy Travis that a lot of people don't know. They think that just because Randy has had such great success in the music business, that he's just rolling in money and never has to have a concern. That's just not the way the music business works." Travis has since turned to generative AI as a potential method of restarting his career. Label executive Chris Lacey told CBS News, "We started with this concept of, what would AI for good look like for us? And the first thing that came to mind was, we would give Randy Travis his voice back."
It's pretty awesome.
Awesome is the perfect word.
It's not over yet.
If you or anyone you know needs help with addiction issues, help is available. Visit the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration website or contact SAMHSA's national helpline at 1-800-662-HELP, 4357.